Tonight, we are going to spend some time with a number of ideas that come from Japan. Ideas that developed across many centuries, through many different traditions, and that offer some rather different ways of relating to time, imperfection, purpose, and the ordinary experience of being alive. Before we begin, it is worth saying clearly that there is no single philosophy called Japanese philosophy, in the way there might be said to be a single system called Stoicism or a single religion called Buddhism. What we are going to explore tonight is closer to a gathering of related but distinct traditions. Some of them come from Zen Buddhist practice, brought to Japan from China many centuries ago, and shaped by Japanese monks, poets, and tea masters into something quite particular. Some of them come from Shinto, the indigenous set of practices and beliefs concerned with sacred presences in nature and place, which existed in Japan long before Buddhism arrived. Some of them come from classical Japanese literature, written by court poets and diarists 1,000 years ago. Some of them come from the aesthetics of tea ceremony, or from martial arts training halls, or from craftsmen's workshops, or from the language of ordinary daily life. A few of them, we should be honest, have been softened, simplified, or reshaped in recent decades as they traveled into other cultures, including the culture many of us live in now. So tonight is not a lesson in a single doctrine. It is more like being shown into a room full of old and different objects, each one carrying its own history, and being given time to sit with each of them, to turn them over slowly, and to notice what they might quietly suggest about how a life could be lived, or at least how it could be seen. The thread that runs through all of it, if there is one, is this: a peaceful life may not come from perfecting things, finishing things, or accumulating more of them. It may come instead from learning to see what is already here a little differently, not from control, not from certainty, not from arriving somewhere final, but from a shift in attention, a softening of the demand that things be otherwise than they are. We will talk about broken and mended objects, and why their cracks might make them more valuable rather than less. We will talk about cherry blossoms, and why their falling might be part of their beauty rather than a betrayal of it. We will talk about the idea of a reason for living, and why that reason does not need to announce itself with trumpets. We will talk about silence, mystery, empty space, unrepeatable moments, and things that cannot be helped. We will talk about waste and gradual growth, and the sacredness that might already exist in the ordinary corners of a life, without anyone having declared them special. None of this is meant to tell you what to do. There will be no instructions tonight, no 5 steps toward a better life, no exercises to complete before morning. If anything, the opposite. This is a night for loosening the grip a little, for considering, quietly, whether a life needs to be perfect, permanent, or fully understood before it is allowed to be beautiful. The room is quiet. The night is long enough. Let us begin. There is a word in Japanese aesthetics, Wabi-Sabi, that has become rather fashionable in recent years, printed on candles and stationery, used to describe minimalist interiors with exposed wood and a single ceramic bowl on a shelf. It is worth setting that version aside for a moment, not because it is entirely wrong, but because it is thin. Underneath the popular version is something older, stranger, and considerably more interesting. Wabi-Sabi is actually two words joined together, each with its own long history. Wabi originally carried a sense of loneliness, of living simply and humbly, sometimes even a kind of quiet poverty, particularly the poverty of a hermit or a monk who has withdrawn from the busyness of court life. It carried melancholy in it. Over centuries, especially through the influence of Zen Buddhism and the tea tradition, that melancholy began to be seen differently. The simplicity of having little was no longer only a hardship. It became a kind of clarity, a stripping away of what was unnecessary, revealing something quieter and more honest underneath. Sabi, the second word, is related to the idea of things that have aged, things that show the passage of time on their surface. A garden wall covered in moss, metal that has taken on the colouring of rust, wood that has weathered and greyed under years of sun and rain. Sabi is not simply about age. It is about the specific beauty that can appear only because time has passed. A new object cannot have it. It has to be earned through duration. Together, Wabi-Sabi came to describe an aesthetic sensibility that finds beauty in things that are imperfect, incomplete, impermanent, and humble. Not despite these qualities, but sometimes because of them. This sensibility became deeply connected to the Japanese tea tradition, particularly through the work of a tea master named Sen no Rikyu, who lived in the 16th century. Before his influence, tea gatherings among the wealthy in Japan had often been elaborate and showy, filled with imported Chinese ceramics and displays of expensive taste. Sen no Rikyu moved in a different direction. He favored rough, irregular, locally made bowls over polished imported ones. He designed tea rooms that were small, plain, and unadorned, sometimes requiring guests to crawl through a low doorway to enter, which had the effect of removing status and rank at the threshold, since a samurai with a sword could not easily crawl through such a door armed. Inside, there might be a single flower in a simple vase, a modest scroll, natural light filtering through paper screens. Nothing was there to impress. Everything was there to be present with. This was not simplicity as deprivation. It was simplicity as a kind of attention. When there are fewer objects in a room, and when those objects are imperfect rather than flawless, something interesting happens to the way a person perceives them. A perfectly smooth, symmetrical, machine-made bowl can be admired, but there is a way in which it asks very little of the person looking at it. It has already announced everything about itself. An irregular, hand-formed bowl, with a slightly uneven rim and a glaze that pooled unevenly during firing, invites a longer look. It has a history. It shows the hand that made it. It is not finished in the sense of being flawless. It is finished in the sense of being complete as itself. There is a well-known practice in Japan called kintsugi, the repair of broken ceramics using lacquer mixed with powdered gold, so that the cracks in a bowl or a cup are not hidden, but are instead illuminated, traced in shining gold lines across the surface of the object. A broken bowl repaired this way does not pretend the break never happened. It does the opposite. It makes the break the most visible part of the object's history. The bowl becomes, in a sense, more itself after the damage than it was before, because now it carries a visible record of what it has been through. It would be too easy to reduce all of this to a simple message, something like, "Your flaws make you beautiful," print it on a mug, move on. That is not quite what Wabi-Sabi is pointing toward, and it is worth resisting the urge to flatten it that way. The deeper question is not whether imperfection is secretly good. The deeper question is why we assumed perfection was the standard in the first place. Consider an object that is flawless, symmetrical, and new. It is, in a sense, outside of time. It has not yet been touched by use, weather, or accident. It exists in a kind of suspended state, a photograph of a single moment rather than a record of a duration. Now consider an object that has been used for 20 years, that has a chip in its handle, a stain that will not quite come out, a repair along one edge. This object has a story that the first one does not. It has existed inside time rather than outside it. Its imperfections are, in a very literal sense, evidence that it has lived. Human life is not so different from this. We tend to imagine an ideal version of ourselves, one without the mistakes, without the awkward years, without the failed relationships or the abandoned plans, without the wrinkles or the scars, and we quietly measure our actual life against that imagined flawless one. But that imagined life has never existed in time. It is a photograph, not a life. The actual life, imperfect and marked by everything it has been through, is the only one that has genuinely happened. A person's face after 60 years is not simply a damaged version of their face at 20. It carries decades of expression, weather, laughter, grief, and thought. A relationship that has weathered arguments, boredom, and long stretches of ordinary days is not a failed version of an easier relationship. It is a relationship that has actually been lived in, the way a house is lived in rather than merely photographed for a listing. An ambition that changed shape halfway through, that became something smaller or different or stranger than what was originally planned, is not automatically a failure of the original plan. It might simply be what happens when a plan meets time. This does not mean imperfection should be sought out for its own sake, or that carelessness should be mistaken for authenticity. Wabi-Sabi is not an excuse to stop caring. Senno Rikyu's tea rooms were not sloppy. They were deliberately, carefully simple, every element considered with great attention. The irregularity in a hand-thrown bowl is not the absence of skill. It is often the presence of a different kind of skill, one that allows the material and the process to remain visible rather than erasing every trace of the making. Perhaps what Wabi-Sabi is really offering is permission to stop treating imperfection as a temporary problem to be corrected before life can properly begin. The chipped bowl does not need to become a new bowl before it can be used again. The aging body does not need to become a young body again before it can be worth inhabiting. The unfinished ambition does not need to become the original plan again before the years spent pursuing it can be considered meaningful. There is a particular kind of relief available in this way of seeing. If value depends on flawlessness, then almost nothing in a lived life can ever fully qualify, because almost nothing that exists in time remains flawless for very long. But if value can include the marks of time, the unevenness, the visible history of having been used, touched, and lived, then very little needs to be hidden or apologized for. The chip in the bowl is not a flaw hiding real value underneath. In a certain light, the chip is part of where the value actually is. Outside, if there happens to be rain tonight, it is worth listening to it for a moment, the way it falls unevenly on different surfaces, harder on the window, softer somewhere further away. Nothing about that sound is symmetrical or engineered. It simply happens, imperfect and unrepeated, and there is nothing missing from it. There is a particular feeling, one that most people will recognize even if they have never had a word for it, that arrives when something beautiful is also, at the very same moment, understood to be temporary. Watching a child sleep, knowing that this exact size, this exact face, this exact stage of their life will not exist in a year's time. Standing beneath a tree in full bloom, aware that within a week or two the flowers will have fallen. Sitting with an old friend on an ordinary evening, sensing somewhere beneath the conversation that evenings like this one are numbered, even if the number is unknown. In Japanese literary and aesthetic thought, there is a phrase for this feeling, mohno no ahwa rai, which can be roughly understood as the pathos of things, or a sensitivity to the ahwa rai, the deep feeling, contained within mohno, the things and events of the world. It describes an emotional and aesthetic responsiveness to impermanence, a gentle sorrow that arises not because something is wrong, but because something beautiful is passing, as beautiful things do. This idea has deep roots in classical Japanese literature, particularly in the writing of the Heian period, over 1,000 years ago, a time of court life, poetry, and diary writing largely produced by women of the aristocracy, who wrote with extraordinary sensitivity about the small, fleeting details of daily experience. The concept became especially associated, in later scholarship, with reading of the great work known in English as The Tale of Genji, a sprawling narrative of court life, love, and loss, in which characters again and again encounter beauty precisely at the moment it is slipping away. A robe faded slightly by wear, a moon glimpsed through moving clouds, a love affair that both people know cannot last. The scholar Moturi Norinaga, writing centuries later, argued that this sensitivity to ahwa-rei, this capacity to be moved by the transient nature of things, was at the very heart of what made such literature emotionally true, more true, in his view, than literature that simply illustrated moral lessons. It is worth pausing on why this matters. There is a way of thinking, common enough, that treats sadness about impermanence as simply an unfortunate side effect of caring about things, something to be minimized or managed. Mohno no ahwa-rei suggests something different. It suggests that the sadness is not separate from the beauty. It is woven into it. The specific poignancy of watching cherry blossoms fall is not available to someone who believes, mistakenly, that the blossoms will remain forever. It is only available to someone who understands, even if only in the background of their awareness, that this particular bloom, this particular week of pink and white against a grey sky, will not come again in exactly this form. Cherry blossoms occupy a very particular place in Japanese aesthetic and cultural life for exactly this reason. In spring, across the country, people gather beneath blooming cherry trees, sometimes for days at a stretch, eating and drinking and talking beneath branches that are, at that very moment, already beginning to shed their petals. The flowering period is short, often no more than a week or two, and this brevity is not treated as a flaw in the blossom's design. It is treated as central to why the blossom matters as much as it does. A flower that bloomed forever would not carry the same emotional weight. Its permanence would flatten it. The cherry blossom is precious partly because it insists on leaving. There is an old poem attributed to the poet Saigyo, a monk who lived in the 12th century, expressing a wish to die in springtime beneath the blossoms, during the very season associated with their falling. Whether or not the sentiment is read literally, it captures something of how deeply intertwined beauty and transience had become in this particular strand of Japanese poetic sensibility. The blossom was not admired in spite of its brief life. It was admired, in part, because of it. This way of feeling extends far beyond flowers. Autumn brings its own version, the turning of leaves to red and gold before they fall, another seasonal reminder that color and vividness in nature often arrive not at the peak of permanence, but at the edge of ending. A leaf is often at its most visually striking in the days just before it dies and drops from the branch. There is something quietly instructive in that, even if the instruction is never stated outright. The brightest moments do not always occur at the point of greatest stability. Sometimes they occur precisely at the threshold of change. It would be a misunderstanding to treat Mohno no Ahwa Rei as simply a fancy word for pessimism, or for a general sadness about the fact that everything ends. Pessimism, as it is often understood, tends to argue that because things end, they are therefore diminished, perhaps even meaningless. Mohno no Ahwa Rei does not make that argument. It does not conclude that because the blossoms fall, the blossoms were pointless. It suggests something closer to the opposite. Because the blossoms fall, the specific week of their blooming becomes more precious, not less. The awareness of ending sharpens attention rather than dulling it. Consider two ways a person might relate to a particular evening with someone they love. In the first way, the evening is experienced as one interchangeable unit among many, assumed, perhaps unconsciously, to simply continue indefinitely into similar future evenings, none of them especially remarkable. In the second way, the evening is experienced with an awareness, even a quiet, unspoken one, that this exact configuration of people, place, mood, and time will not occur again in precisely this form. The second way of experiencing the evening does not necessarily involve more happiness in any simple sense. It may, in fact, involve a touch of sorrow, a background awareness of loss, even while the evening is still happening. But it also tends to involve a sharper, more attentive kind of presence. The bittersweetness is not a contamination of the joy. It is often what makes the joy feel real rather than assumed. This connects to something many people encounter later in life, often described as a kind of retrospective ache when looking back at ordinary periods that, at the time, did not feel especially significant. A particular apartment lived in during one's 20s, a particular stretch of years raising small children, a friendship that existed intensely for a period, and then, without any dramatic ending, gradually faded through distance and changing circumstances. At the time, these periods often did not feel like anything special. They felt, simply, like life continuing. It is often only in hindsight, once they have ended, that their specific texture becomes visible, and with it a kind of tender sorrow for a version of life that can no longer be returned to. Mohno no ahwa re offers, in a sense, an invitation to feel some version of that tenderness, while a moment is still happening, rather than only afterward, not through effort or forced sentimentality, but through a willingness to notice, honestly, that whatever is occurring right now is not going to last in exactly this form. The friend across the table will change. You will change. The room you are sitting in will eventually belong to someone else, or cease to exist altogether. None of this needs to be dwelt on morbidly. It can simply sit quietly in the background, the way a low light sits in a room, changing the color of everything without announcing itself directly. There is also something worth noticing about the specific word, ahwa re itself, which does not translate cleanly into a single English word. It is not exactly sadness. It is not exactly appreciation. It sits somewhere between the two, a feeling that requires both at once. English speakers sometimes reach for the phrase bittersweet, and this is probably the closest available equivalent, though even that phrase can feel slightly too casual for what is being described. Aware suggests something closer to being moved, in the fullest sense, by the fact that something exists at all, given that its existing is inseparable from its eventually not existing. Rain against a window at night carries something of this quality too, if it is listened to for more than a moment. Each individual sound, each drop striking glass, happens exactly once, and then is gone, replaced by the next one, which is also unique, also brief, also never to be repeated in that exact form. The whole sound of rain is made up of thousands of these tiny, unrepeatable events, none of which anyone would think to grieve individually. And yet together they form something that many people find, without quite knowing why, deeply soothing to fall asleep to. Perhaps part of what is soothing about it is precisely this quality, a continuous demonstration that passing away and being present are not opposites. They are very often the same event, seen from two different angles. In recent years, a particular diagram has circulated widely, showing 4 overlapping circles, labeled what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for, with a small space where all 4 circles meet labeled Ikigai. It is a tidy image, useful perhaps as a career exercise, and it has been presented in many articles and books as an ancient Japanese secret to a fulfilling life. It is worth being honest about this diagram before going any further. It did not originate in Japan. It appears to have emerged from Western business and self-help writing, which then attached the Japanese word Ikigai to it, somewhat after the fact, likely because the word itself had already begun to attract attention abroad as an appealing, exotic-sounding concept. This does not mean Ikigai is meaningless, or that it was invented recently. The word is old and genuinely Japanese, and its actual meaning, as it has been used historically, and as it continues to be used in everyday Japanese speech, is both simpler and, in a way, more spacious than the 4-circle diagram suggests. Ikigai is formed from iki, meaning life, and gai, related to the word for value or worth. Put together, it is often translated as a reason for living, or that which makes life worth living. But the way it functions in ordinary Japanese usage is considerably more modest than the English phrase might suggest. A person might say that their Ikigai is their grandchildren. Another might say it is their garden. Another might say it is a small business they have run for decades, or a weekly gathering with friends, or the particular pleasure of tending to a specific hobby, such as growing bonsai trees or practicing calligraphy. Researchers studying the concept, including studies of older adults in certain regions of Japan associated with unusually long lifespans, have found that Ikigai tends to be described not as one grand, singular purpose, but as an accumulation of small, often quite ordinary sources of meaning, frequently connected to relationships, routine, and community, rather than to career achievement or personal advancement. This is worth sitting with because it runs against a fairly common assumption in modern life, the assumption that a meaningful existence requires discovering some singular, defining purpose, ideally one that is also unusual, impressive, or externally recognized. Under this assumption, a person who has not identified their one true calling might feel that their life is somehow incomplete, still waiting for its real meaning to arrive. Ikigai, understood in its more grounded historical sense, offers a rather different picture. Meaning does not have to arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It can accumulate quietly, in layers, through ordinary and repeated engagement with people, tasks, and small pleasures. Consider the Ikigai of an elderly fisherman who has spent 60 years going out onto the same stretch of water each morning. From the outside, this might look like a narrow life, a life that lacks the variety or ambition that is often held up as admirable. But from the inside, that same routine might be dense with meaning, woven through decades of familiarity with the sea's particular moods, relationships with other fishermen built over half a lifetime, a body that still knows, almost without thinking, how to move on a small boat, and a sense of continuity with a father or grandfather who did the same work before him. None of this needs to be extraordinary to be sufficient. Its sufficiency comes from its depth, not its scale. Consider, too, that Ikigai does not require a single answer at all. A person might describe several different, overlapping reasons for living, some connected to family, some to work, some to small private pleasures, such as a morning cup of tea, prepared a particular way, or the quiet satisfaction of tending a few plants on a balcony. There is no requirement, within the concept as it is traditionally used, that these sources of meaning be unified into one coherent life mission. They can simply coexist, each one contributing something, none of them needing to justify the others. This matters because the pressure to identify one singular purpose can itself become a source of quiet suffering. A person spends years searching for the one thing they were meant to do, comparing their unremarkable days against an imagined version of life in which everything points toward a single clear destination. But most lives, examined honestly, are not shaped like that. They are shaped more like a garden with many different plants growing at different rates. Some flowering early, some late, some never flowering dramatically at all, but simply staying green and present, quietly contributing to the whole. There is also a philosophical implication buried inside Ikigai that is easy to miss. Reason for living is a curious phrase because it implies that living itself needs a reason, that mere existence is not automatically sufficient and requires some external justification. And yet the actual content of most people's stated Ikigai, when studied closely, tends to be remarkably unspectacular. Caring for a grandchild, preparing a meal for someone, continuing a craft, meeting a friend for tea on a particular day of the week. These are not achievements in the ambitious sense. They are commitments, relationships, and small repeated acts of attention. In other words, the reason for living, for many people, turns out to be closely tied to the ordinary structure of daily life itself, rather than to anything separate from it or above it. This offers a quiet corrective to another common assumption, the idea that meaning must be found outside of routine, as though routine were the enemy of a well-lived life, and meaning had to be imported from somewhere more exciting. Ikigai suggests, instead, that routine can be one of the primary containers in which meaning is held, not despite its repetition, but partly because of it. A weekly visit to a parent, a daily walk along a familiar path, a regular practice of a craft, refined slowly over years. These repeated structures do not have to be interruptions to a meaningful life, waiting to be escaped. They can be where the meaningful life actually resides. None of this is to say that larger ambitions, unusual callings, or significant achievements cannot also be part of a person's Ikigai. They certainly can be, for those who have them. But the concept, in its more accurate historical form, does not require this. It does not rank a life built around caring for a family garden as lesser than a life built around a prestigious career. It simply asks what, specifically, gives this particular life its sense of being's worth continuing, without assuming in advance what the answer ought to look like. There is something worth considering here about the difference between purpose as a destination and purpose as a practice. A destination implies an end point, a moment of arrival after which the searching can stop. A practice implies something ongoing, renewed each day, each week, each season, without a final completion point. Ikigai, understood carefully, seems to lean much closer to the second image. It is not a peak to be reached once and then permanently possessed. It is closer to a set of small, recurring reasons to get up in the morning, which may shift and change across a lifetime, as circumstances shift and change, without ever needing to be resolved into a single, tidy statement of purpose. If tonight brings a quiet return to this question, what gives my life its reasons, it need not be answered with urgency, and it certainly need not be answered with a diagram. It might simply be enough to notice, without judgment, what small things have quietly been carrying that weight all along. There is a habit, common to a great deal of modern life, of treating empty space as a problem waiting to be solved. A silence in conversation is filled quickly with words, sometimes before the previous thought has even finished settling. A quiet moment during the day is filled with a phone, a screen, a notification, some small stream of input to occupy attention that would otherwise be, briefly, unoccupied. A room is filled with furniture and objects until very little bare wall or floor remains visible. Even time itself is often filled, scheduled so tightly that a person can go for long stretches without any interval, that has not already been assigned a purpose. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics, ma, which offers a rather different relationship with emptiness. Ma refers to the interval, the pause, the gap, the space between things. And rather than treating that gap as an absence to be corrected, it treats the gap as something with its own presence and significance. Ma is not simply nothing. Ma is a kind of something, shaped by what surrounds it. This idea appears across a wide range of traditional Japanese arts. In architecture, particularly in traditional Japanese homes, empty space within a room is not considered wasted space waiting to be filled with furnishings. A room with very little in it, lit by soft light through paper screens, is not regarded as unfinished. It is regarded as complete, precisely because of what it leaves open. The emptiness allows the few objects that are present, perhaps a single scroll, a single arrangement of flowers, to be seen with much greater clarity than they would be if surrounded by clutter. In garden design, maha appears in the deliberate spacing between stones, between plantings, between a path and the structures it leads toward. A traditional Japanese garden is rarely dense in the way a formal European garden might be, with every inch planted and shaped. Instead, gaps are left, sometimes quite large ones, not out of neglect but out of care, because the gaps allow the eye to rest, and because they allow the elements that are present, a single stone, a particular tree, a stretch of raked gravel, to be experienced individually rather than dissolved into visual noise. In traditional music, particularly in forms associated with instruments such as the shakuhachi, a bamboo flute historically associated with Zen practice, ma appears as the pause between notes, sometimes a surprisingly long pause, during which no sound is played at all. A listener unfamiliar with this tradition might initially experience these silences as gaps where something is missing, moments where the music has, in some sense, failed to continue. But within the tradition itself, these silences are not failures of the music. They are part of the music. The silence carries the tension and release of the note that came before it, and prepares the space for the note that will come after it. Without the silence, the notes would simply run together into an undifferentiated stream of sound, each one losing some of its individual clarity. This principle extends into conversation as well, though it is applied with less formal deliberation there. In many traditional and everyday contexts within Japanese social life, a pause in conversation is not automatically treated as an awkward silence requiring immediate rescue. It can be allowed to exist, sometimes for a noticeably longer period than might feel comfortable in cultures where continuous verbal filling is the norm. This is not universal, and it would be inaccurate to claim that all conversation in Japan is comfortable with silence in this way, since social norms vary enormously by context, generation, and region. But the cultural resource exists. The idea that a pause between two people speaking is not automatically empty in the negative sense. It can be a space in which something is still occurring, even without words, a kind of shared attentiveness that speech would only interrupt. There is a philosophical question worth sitting with here. What happens when we stop treating emptiness as something that needs to be filled? Consider a single day with one unscheduled hour left open, with nothing planned to occupy it. For many people, that unscheduled hour produces a kind of discomfort, an urge to fill it immediately with a task, an errand, a piece of media, anything to prevent the hour from remaining simply open. But an open hour, left open, is not necessarily wasted. It is available. It has potential, precisely, because it has not yet been claimed by any particular content. It can become whatever the moment calls for, a walk, a period of unstructured thought, a conversation that would not have happened if the hour had already been assigned elsewhere. Ma suggests that the value of a thing is not only found in its content, but also in the space around that content, the space that allows the content to be perceived at all. A painting is not only the painted marks on the paper. It is also, crucially, the unpainted space that surrounds and separates those marks, without which the marks themselves would blur into an undifferentiated mass. A piece of music is not only the notes, but also the silences that give the notes their shape and their individuality. A life, perhaps, is not only its activities and achievements, but also the pauses between them, the periods of rest, waiting, and apparent inactivity that give the activities their contrast and, in a sense, their meaning. This is a difficult idea to hold on to in a culture that tends to measure the value of time primarily by what was accomplished within it. Under such a measure, an empty afternoon looks like nothing happened, a wasted block of hours with no visible output. Ma offers a different lens. An empty afternoon is not automatically nothing. It might be exactly the interval that allows the following morning or the following week to arrive with more clarity. The way a pause in music allows the next note to be heard properly, rather than being lost in an unbroken stream of sound. There is something worth noticing, too, about how Ma relates to rest specifically. Rest understood through this lens is not simply the absence of productive activity, waiting to be justified by the energy it restores for future work. Rest can be understood as having its own quality, its own presence. In the same way, a pause in music is not merely preparation for the next note, but is, in that moment, itself part of what is being experienced. A night like this one, quiet, largely empty of activity, does not necessarily need to be understood only as preparation for a more productive tomorrow. It can simply be its own interval, valuable in itself, without needing to justify its existence through what comes after. If there is stillness in the room right now, it does not need to be filled. It has already, in its own way, arrived. There is a particular kind of beauty that does not fully reveal itself. A mountain seen from a distance, its lower slopes wrapped in mist, so that its base cannot quite be located, its true scale left uncertain. Moonlight filtering through moving clouds, appearing and disappearing in a rhythm that cannot be predicted or controlled. The sound of something moving in a forest at dusk, unseen, its source never confirmed. A piece of music that ends on a note that does not resolve, leaving something unfinished hanging in the air after the final sound has faded. In Japanese aesthetics, particularly in the traditional performing art of NOH theatre, there is a term for this quality, Yūgen, often translated imperfectly as mystery, or profound and subtle depth, or an awareness of something beyond what can be directly perceived or fully articulated. The term was developed with particular sophistication by the NOH playwright and theorist Zai Mi, who lived and worked in the 14th and 15th centuries, and who wrote extensively about the qualities that made a theatrical performance move an audience beyond mere technical skill. For Zai Mi, Yūgen was not simply beauty in the ordinary sense, the kind of beauty that can be fully seen and appreciated at a glance. It was something closer to the beauty of suggestion, of restraint, of a surface that hints at depths the audience cannot fully access. He compared it, in some of his writing, to the image of a bird flying out from among flowers, glimpsed only briefly before it disappears from view, or to the sight of the moon hidden behind a thin veil of cloud. In both images, what is partially obscured carries more weight than what is fully visible would carry on its own. A flower in full, unobstructed bloom might be admired, but a flower glimpsed only partially through mist or shadow tends to draw the observer inward, toward a kind of imaginative reaching that full visibility does not require. This is a subtle distinction, and it is worth being careful not to flatten it into something simpler than it is. Yūgen is not merely about things being vague or unclear for the sake of vagueness. It is about a particular quality of depth that becomes perceptible precisely because it is not entirely graspable. A no performance, traditionally, moves with extreme slowness and restraint. The masks worn by the performers are static, carved with expressions that do not change. And yet, skilled performers are able to suggest, through the angle of the mask catching light differently as the head tilts, an extraordinary range of emotion, grief, longing, rage, tenderness, none of which is ever explicitly shown. The audience is not told what to feel. They are given a surface that suggests, and they are left to complete the rest with their own perception. Yūgen appears outside the theatre as well, in poetry, in garden design, in painting, particularly in the ink wash paintings associated with Zen-influenced art, where a single mountain might be suggested with only a few strokes of ink. The rest of the paper left blank, and yet the viewer perceives an entire landscape, filled in by their own imagination, working with the minimal information provided. This is quite different from a highly detailed, fully rendered image that leaves nothing to be supplied by the viewer. The sparse ink painting invites participation. It does not simply present. It gestures and trusts the viewer to meet it part way. There is a philosophical question embedded in all of this that reaches well beyond aesthetics. Is it possible that some of the most significant experiences available to a person are, by their nature, not fully explicable? Consider trying to explain, in complete and exhaustive language, why a particular piece of music moves someone to tears, or why a certain quality of light on a particular evening produces a feeling that seems to reach further than the light itself would justify, or why an encounter with another person, brief and seemingly unremarkable on the surface, leaves behind a sense that something important has occurred, without either person being able to say exactly what that something was. These experiences resist full explanation, not because language has failed in some correctable way, but because the experiences themselves may contain a dimension that language, by its nature, cannot completely capture. Modern culture tends to be uncomfortable with this kind of residual mystery. there is a strong pull toward explanation, toward the assumption that anything genuinely important ought to be, in principle, fully understandable, fully articulable, fully reducible to clear statements. Under this assumption, an experience that resists explanation might be regarded with suspicion, as something not yet properly understood, rather than something that, by its nature, exceeds understanding. Yūgen offers a different orientation. It suggests that some of the deepest and most valuable experiences may be precisely the ones that cannot be fully brought into the light, the ones that retain, even after long reflection, a portion that remains in shadow or in mist or beyond the edge of what can be clearly seen. This does not mean such experiences should be treated as meaningless simply because they resist explanation. It suggests, instead, that the resistance to explanation might itself be part of what makes them significant. Think of a distant mountain range at dusk, its peaks visible, but its lower slopes lost in haze, its exact scale and distance impossible to judge with certainty from where one stands. A fully visible, brightly lit mountain, its every detail clear under strong sunlight, is certainly beautiful in its own way, but it does not produce quite the same feeling as the misted, partially obscured version. The uncertainty itself, the not quite knowing where the mountain begins and ends, seems to be doing something. It creates a kind of pull, an invitation to imagine what is not directly visible. And that imaginative reaching often produces a deeper, more lingering impression than full visibility would have produced. There may be something worth considering here about the way we relate to other people as well. A friendship or a relationship in which everything about the other person has been fully explained, fully mapped, fully understood, with no remaining mystery, might in some sense feel complete. But it might also, in another sense, feel thinner than a relationship in which some portion of the other person always remains slightly beyond full comprehension, glimpsed rather than fully grasped, the way the moon is glimpsed through moving cloud rather than seen in a fixed, unchanging, fully illuminated state. Perhaps some of the depth people sense in long relationships that have lasted for decades, comes not from having fully solved the other person, but from continuing to encounter, even after many years, some remaining portion of them that cannot be entirely known. There is no need to resolve this tonight, or to explain it more fully than it has already been described. Some things, as Yūgen suggests, are better left partly in the dark. The mystery does not need to be corrected. It might simply be part of what makes the thing worth returning to. There is a particular kind of interference that can occur between a person and their own actions, an interference caused not by lack of skill or lack of care, but by too much self-conscious attention directed at the action while it is happening. A musician who has practiced a piece for years can sometimes stumble over a passage they have played perfectly hundreds of times before, simply because, in that particular performance, they became suddenly and acutely aware of their own hands, watching themselves play rather than simply playing. A person walking down a familiar staircase can trip after becoming unusually conscious of the mechanics of walking, something the body ordinarily manages without any conscious oversight at all. Attention, in these cases, does not sharpen the action. it disrupts it. Within Zen Buddhist thought, and within various Japanese martial and artistic traditions influenced by it, there is a concept addressing precisely this phenomenon, Mushin, sometimes translated as no mind. The translation can be misleading if taken too literally, since Mushin does not describe a blank or empty mind in the sense of having no mental activity at all. It describes something more specific, a state in which the mind is not rigidly fixed upon any single thought, is not caught in self-referential commentary about its own performance, and is therefore able to respond to circumstances with a kind of immediacy that excessive deliberation tends to interrupt. This concept developed with particular depth within Japanese swordsmanship and other martial traditions, where the stakes of hesitation were, quite literally, matters of life and death. A swordsman who paused to consciously think through each possible response to an opponent's movement would, in a real encounter, already be too slow. The various schools of swordsmanship that engaged seriously with Zen practice were not primarily interested in producing fighters who thought carefully during combat. They were interested in producing fighters whose years of training had settled so deeply into the body that conscious thought was no longer necessary in the moment of action, freeing the mind from the kind of self-conscious deliberation that would otherwise slow the response and, in doing so, create an opening for defeat. It is worth being careful here, because Mushin is easily misunderstood as simply not thinking, as though the goal were to switch off the mind entirely, to become thoughtless in the ordinary sense of careless or unaware. This is not quite right. Mushin is closer to a mind that has thoughts arise and pass without becoming stuck to any particular one of them, without the mind becoming so absorbed in a single thought, especially a self-referential thought about how one is doing, that it loses its capacity to remain responsive to what is actually occurring in the present moment. Consider a craftsman with decades of experience shaping wood or clay, whose hands seem to know what to do almost independently of conscious instruction. This does not mean the craftsman has stopped thinking. It means that so much of the necessary knowledge has been absorbed through years of repetition that it no longer needs to pass through the slow, effortful channel of conscious deliberation. The thinking has, in a sense, migrated into the hands. This is not the absence of intelligence. It is intelligence that has become so thoroughly integrated that it no longer announces itself as separate, deliberate thought. There is a particular kind of self-consciousness that many people carry into ordinary activities, not just skilled performances, but everyday moments, a kind of running internal narration that observes and comments on the self even while the self is acting, walking into a room and being aware simultaneously of how one is walking, how one appears, whether one seems awkward or composed, speaking with another person while also monitoring, in a separate mental track, how the conversation is being received, whether the right thing was said, whether the previous sentence sounded foolish. This double layer, acting and simultaneously observing oneself act, tends to produce a kind of stiffness, a self-consciousness that can be sensed by others even when they cannot name exactly what they are sensing. Mushin suggests the possibility of a mind less burdened by this double layer, not a mind that has stopped caring, and not a mind that has become careless or unaware, but a mind that is able to be fully engaged with what is actually happening, without a constant secondary commentary running alongside it, evaluating, judging, comparing the present moment against some imagined standard of how it ought to be going. This connects, in a quiet way, to something many people have experienced without necessarily having a word for it, sometimes described in other contexts as a state of flow, a state in which a person becomes so absorbed in an activity, whether it is a physical task, a creative project, a conversation, or even a simple walk, that the usual internal chatter falls away, and action and awareness seem to merge into a single, unbroken movement, without the interruption of constant self-evaluation. Time often seems to pass differently during such states, sometimes faster, sometimes barely registering at all, because the part of the mind that would ordinarily be tracking and narrating the experience has, for a while, gone quiet. It would be a mistake to treat Mushin as something that can simply be summoned through effort, since the very act of trying hard to achieve a quiet, unself-conscious mind tends to produce exactly the opposite, an intensely self-conscious effort to appear or feel unself-conscious, which defeats the purpose entirely. Zen traditions have generally been quite clear on this point, that Mushin, like many states of genuine ease, tends to arise not through direct pursuit, but through long practice, familiarity, and a gradual loosening of the grip that self-conscious evaluation tends to hold over ordinary experience. It is less something to be achieved in a single effort, and more something that becomes more available the longer a person practices a given activity, or the longer they sit with the discomfort of not needing every moment to be evaluated and judged as it happens. There is something worth noticing here about the difference between thinking and being ruled by thought. The mind will inevitably produce thoughts, plans, judgments, comparisons, worries. Mushin does not require the elimination of these. It suggests, instead, a different relationship with them, one in which thoughts are allowed to arise and pass without each one demanding to be followed, examined, and resolved before the next moment can be permitted to occur. A thought can simply be a thought, present for a moment and then gone, rather than something that must be gripped tightly and carried forward, lying quietly at this hour, with the mind perhaps still producing its usual late-night traffic of small worries and stray considerations. There is no requirement to silence any of it forcefully. It may simply be enough to notice that the thoughts, whatever they are, do not need to be followed all the way to their conclusions tonight. They can be allowed to pass, the way clouds pass across a night sky, present for a while, and then, without any particular effort, gone. There is a phrase associated with the Japanese tea tradition, Ichigo Ichie, which translates roughly as one time, one meeting, or one encounter once. It is often traced back to the influence of the same tea master mentioned earlier, Sen no Rikyu, and to the broader philosophy of the tea ceremony as it developed over the following centuries, though the specific phrase itself was formalized somewhat later in the writing of a 19th century tea master named Ii Naosuke. The idea at its center is simple to state and considerably harder to fully absorb. Each gathering, each meeting between people occurs exactly once and can never be precisely repeated. even if the same people meet again in what looks, on the surface, like the same circumstances. Within the formal tea ceremony, this idea carried very practical implications. A host preparing tea for guests was traditionally encouraged to treat each gathering as though it might be the only time these particular people would ever meet in exactly this configuration, under exactly these circumstances, and to bring to the preparation of the tea a corresponding quality of care and attentiveness, since the specific occasion, once concluded, could never be recreated. Even if the same guests returned the following month, they would not be quite the same people. A month would have passed. Something in each of their lives would have shifted, however slightly. The season would be different. The light through the windows would fall at a different angle. The tea itself, made from a particular batch of leaves, would taste slightly different from the tea served the previous month. What looked, from the outside, like a repeated event was, in fact, an entirely new and unrepeatable one, dressed in the familiar clothing of routine. This way of thinking asks something fairly demanding of a person, which is to resist the habit of treating familiar or routine encounters as though they were interchangeable copies of each other. It is an easy habit to fall into. A weekly dinner with the same family members, a regular meeting with the same colleagues, an ordinary morning greeting exchanged with the same neighbor can all begin to feel, after enough repetitions, like variations on a single template, rather than as distinct events, each happening exactly once, never to be repeated in precisely that form. But consider what is actually true of even the most seemingly routine of these encounters. The particular weather on that specific day, the particular mood each person happened to be carrying with them, shaped by whatever had happened earlier that day or that week, the particular stage each person was at in their own unfolding life, closer to or further from some event that would later prove significant. None of this can ever be exactly reproduced. A conversation with an aging parent, held on an ordinary Tuesday evening, occurs at a specific and unrepeatable point in both of your lives. The parent is a specific age on that Tuesday, an age they will never be again. The child, whatever their own age, carries into that conversation a specific accumulation of everything that has happened between them up to that point, an accumulation that will have shifted, even if only slightly, by the time of the next conversation. Ichigo Ichie does not require that every encounter be treated as dramatic or momentous in an obvious sense. Most encounters, examined honestly, are quite ordinary. A shared meal, a brief exchange of words while passing someone on a familiar path, a quiet evening spent in the same room as another person, without much being said at all. The philosophy does not ask that these ordinary encounters be forced into some artificial significance they do not naturally carry. It asks something quieter and perhaps more sustainable, an underlying awareness, held gently rather than gripped tightly, that this particular ordinary moment, exactly as it is, will not occur again. There is a difference worth drawing out here between forced gratitude and this kind of quiet awareness. Forced gratitude often involves a kind of effortful reminder, telling oneself repeatedly that a moment ought to be appreciated because it is fleeting. A reminder that can, if applied too insistently, begin to feel like pressure rather than presence. Ichigo Ichie, at least as it is described within the tea tradition, seems to point toward something gentler, closer to a background sensitivity than to a foreground effort. The host preparing tea is not straining to feel grateful for the occasion. They are simply attending carefully to what is actually in front of them: the specific guests, the specific weather, the specific quality of the specific tea being poured on this specific afternoon. Because attending carefully to what is actually present is, in itself, a natural expression of recognizing that it will not remain present indefinitely. This connects closely to the earlier reflection on Mono no Ahwa Rei, the sensitivity to the passing nature of things, though Ichigo Ichie emphasizes something slightly different, less the sorrow of passing and more the singularity of what is currently occurring. Every meeting between two people, however many times they have met before, is, in a strict sense, a first and only meeting of exactly this version of each of them, at exactly this point in both of their lives. There is something worth considering about how this idea relates to memory as well. A memory of a particular encounter, however vivid, can only ever be a partial trace of the original moment, reconstructed and altered slightly each time it is recalled. The actual moment itself, once it has passed, cannot be recovered in its full original form, no matter how carefully it is remembered. This is not a reason for sadness exactly, though it can carry a touch of the Awa Rei discussed earlier. It is, instead, a reason for a particular kind of attentiveness, while the moment is still occurring, since the moment itself, not the later memory of it, is the only version that will ever exist in full. Consider an ordinary evening, perhaps not unlike this one, in which nothing especially remarkable happens. A meal is eaten, some words are exchanged, or perhaps very few words at all. The evening ends, as evenings do, and gives way to night. There is no obvious reason such an evening would later be remembered as significant. And in fact, most such evenings are not remembered individually at all, dissolving instead into a general sense of what a particular period of life felt like. And yet each one of these unremarkable evenings occurred exactly once, in exactly this form, contributing, in ways too diffuse to trace precisely, to the overall shape of a life and a set of relationships that could not have taken quite the same shape without it. There is no need to try to hold on to this evening, or any evening, more tightly than it naturally allows. Ichigo Ichie does not ask for a tighter grip. If anything, it asks for a looser one, an attentiveness that does not grasp, a recognition that this particular arrangement of time, place, and people has already, in a sense, begun its passing, and that this passing does not diminish what is happening now. It may, in fact, be part of what makes it worth noticing at all. There is a phrase used in ordinary Japanese speech, Shikata gahnie, which translates loosely as it cannot be helped, or there is no way around this, or nothing can be done about it. It is used in a wide range of situations, from minor inconveniences, a train delayed by weather, a shop closed unexpectedly, to far more serious circumstances, illness, loss, and hardship of various kinds. It is worth approaching this phrase with some care, because it has occasionally been misrepresented, both outside Japan and within certain historical contexts, as an expression of passive resignation, a kind of cultural fatalism that discourages resistance to injustice or hardship that could, in fact, be changed. This is a serious misunderstanding, and it is worth being honest about the history here, since the phrase has, at times, been invoked in troubling ways, including in historical contexts, where it was used to encourage quiet acceptance of circumstances that arguably should have been resisted rather than accepted. Setting that history aside for a moment, the underlying philosophical distinction that Shikata can point toward, when understood carefully rather than crudely, is a genuinely useful one, and it is not unique to Japanese thought, appearing in various forms across many philosophical traditions, including, notably, in ancient Stoic philosophy in the West, with its own careful distinction between what lies within a person's control and what does not. The distinction is this: there's a difference between accepting that something has happened, or that something is currently the case, and approving of it, endorsing it, or believing it ought to have happened. Acceptance of reality is not the same thing as agreement with reality. Consider the weather. Rain falls on a day when rain was not wanted, perhaps ruining an outdoor gathering that had been planned for weeks. There are two separate things happening in a situation like this. There's the fact of the rain itself, which is entirely outside anyone's control, a simple feature of reality on that particular day. And there is the internal response to the rain, which typically involves a kind of resistance, a wish that things were otherwise, sometimes accompanied by frustration, disappointment, or a lingering sense of unfairness. Shikata, in its more careful sense, addresses only the first part. The rain cannot be helped. This is simply a statement of fact, not an instruction about how to feel, and certainly not an instruction to feel nothing at all, or to pretend the disappointment does not exist. The distinction becomes more significant when applied to larger and more painful circumstances. Aging cannot be helped. The body changes, slows, and eventually fails, regardless of how carefully it has been cared for. Death, eventually, cannot be helped, neither one's own nor, far more painfully, the deaths of people who are loved. The past cannot be helped, in the specific sense that whatever has already happened, and no amount of wishing, regretting, or replaying alternate scenarios in the mind will alter what has occurred. Other people's decisions, particularly the decisions of people whose choices affect us, but whom we cannot control, often cannot be helped either, in the sense that we typically have no direct power to reach into another person's mind and change what they have decided, however much we might wish we could. There is a particular and very common form of suffering that comes not from difficult circumstances themselves, but from an ongoing internal argument with those circumstances, a kind of repeated, exhausting insistence held in the mind that things should have gone differently, that reality has made some kind of mistake by unfolding the way it has. This internal argument can continue for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime, attached to a decision made decades ago, a loss suffered long in the past, a circumstance of birth or health that was never within anyone's control to begin with. The argument does not change what happened. It simply adds a second layer of suffering on top of whatever suffering the original circumstance already contained, a layer made of resistance rather than of the circumstance itself. Shikata ga nye, understood generously, offers a way of setting down that second layer, without necessarily requiring that the first layer, the actual grief, disappointment, or hardship, be minimized or dismissed. It is entirely possible to say, quietly and honestly, this cannot be helped, while still feeling the full weight of sadness that the circumstance carries. The phrase is not asking for numbness. It is asking for an end to the additional exhaustion of insisting over and over that reality ought to have been different from what it actually was. This distinction matters considerably for the question of what can, in fact, be changed. A confusion between acceptance and passivity can lead a person to believe that acknowledging what cannot be helped means giving up on everything, including circumstances that genuinely could be changed through effort or action. But the distinction actually clarifies this rather than confusing it. Recognizing clearly what lies outside one's control frees up attention and energy for what does lie within it. A person who spends years arguing internally with an illness they did not choose and cannot cure has less remaining energy for the parts of their situation that can still be shaped. How they spend the time they do have, how they relate to the people around them, what small comforts and pleasures remain available to them. Shikata ga, properly understood, is not the opposite of action. It can be what clears the ground for effective action to take place, by removing the wasted effort of fighting battles that were never winnable in the first place. There is a difference, too, between Shikata ga applied to genuinely unchangeable circumstances and its misuse as an excuse for accepting injustices or hardships that could, in fact, be addressed or resisted. A society's laws, a workplace's practices, a relationship's patterns, these are often changeable, even if changing them is difficult, and it would be a distortion of this philosophy to apply it as a blanket instruction to accept anything unpleasant without question. The phrase, at its most honest, is meant for the specific category of things that genuinely cannot be altered: the weather, the past, the fact of mortality, the choices already made by other people, rather than as a general instruction toward passivity in the face of anything difficult. Perhaps the clearest way to hold this idea is as a question rather than a rule. Of everything currently weighing on the mind at this hour, which parts belong to the category of what has already happened, or what lies entirely outside anyone's control, and which parts belong to the category of what might still, with effort, be shaped differently? The first category does not require solving tonight. It may not require solving at all. It may simply require, eventually, a kind of quiet laying down of the argument that has been carried against it for so long. The night outside continues, regardless of how anyone feels about it. Morning will arrive at its own pace. Neither of these facts asks for approval. They simply are what they are, and there is a certain rest available in no longer insisting otherwise. There is a word in Japanese, Mottainai, often used as a kind of spontaneous exclamation when something valuable is being wasted, thrown away carelessly, or left unused despite still having worth. It is said over food left uneaten on a plate. It is said over a perfectly functional object, discarded simply because a newer version has become available. It is said, sometimes, over time itself, when a period of life passes without being noticed or appreciated. The word carries a sense that something of value is being treated as though it had no value, and that this mistreatment is, in a fairly direct sense, a kind of loss, even when nothing has been physically destroyed. Mottainai is often associated in contemporary discussion with environmental concerns, and this association is not incorrect, since the word is regularly invoked in Japan in exactly this context, encouraging conservation, reuse, and reduction of waste. But the concept, examined more closely, reaches beyond environmentalism into something more broadly philosophical, concerning attention, appreciation, and the relationship between people and the things and the time that make up their lives. Consider an object that has been carefully made, a wooden bowl, a woven textile, a piece of furniture built by someone who understood the material well and gave real time and attention to its construction. Such an object represents, in a very concrete sense, hours of someone's life. The wood came from a tree that took years or decades to grow. The maker spent time learning the skill required to shape it well, and then spent further time actually shaping this particular piece. To discard such an object carelessly, replacing it with something newer or more fashionable, while it still functions perfectly well, is not merely inefficient in a narrow economic sense. It represents a kind of disregard for all of that accumulated time and effort, treated as though it were worth nothing at all. This does not mean every object must be kept forever, regardless of its condition, or that Mottainai demands a household cluttered with things that no longer serve any purpose. The concept is not primarily about hoarding. It is about a quality of attention, a willingness to notice the value that is already present in what one has, rather than reflexively looking past it toward whatever is newer, unused, or not yet possessed. An old coat, worn for many winters, carries a different kind of value than a new coat purchased to replace it, even if the new coat is, by some measures, superior. The old coat has been present through actual winters, actual weather, actual days of a particular life. It has a history that the new coat has not yet had the chance to accumulate. There is a particular relationship between Mottainai and the earlier discussion of Wabi-Sabi worth drawing out here. Wabi-Sabi finds beauty in objects marked by age and use. Mottainai extends this into an ethical register, suggesting that failing to appreciate such objects, replacing them prematurely, treating them as disposable, is not simply an aesthetic oversight, but a kind of waste in the fuller sense of the word, a squandering of value that was already present and freely available, requiring nothing further to access except attention. Food carries this quality with particular clarity. A meal represents not only the ingredients themselves, but the labor of growing them, harvesting them, transporting them, and preparing them, an entire chain of human and natural effort compressed into a single plate. To waste food carelessly is to discard all of that accumulated effort at once, along with the resources, the water, the soil, the labor, that went into producing it in the first place. Mottainai said quietly over an uneaten portion, is not primarily about guilt. It is more accurately understood as a moment of recognition, an acknowledgement of everything that was required to bring this particular food to this particular table, an acknowledgement that tends to be lost entirely when food is treated as simply and endlessly available without cost or history. There is a broader application worth considering as well, concerning time itself. A period of one's life, a particular stretch of yours, perhaps a period that felt uneventful or unremarkable while it was happening, can later be recognized as having contained a great deal that went unnoticed at the time. Relationships that were present but not fully appreciated. Ordinary days that passed without much attention because nothing about them seemed to demand it. In retrospect, such periods can sometimes provoke a version of the Mottainai feeling, a recognition that something valuable was, in fact, present all along, and that its value went largely unnoticed, simply because attention was directed elsewhere, toward some imagined future that seemed, at the time, more important than the actual present moment being lived. This connects to a broader tendency, common enough that it barely needs describing, of treating whatever is currently possessed, whether an object, a relationship, or a period of time, as somehow less valuable than whatever is not yet possessed. Some future object, relationship, or achievement that has not yet arrived. Under this tendency, satisfaction is perpetually deferred, always attached to the next acquisition, rather than to what is already present and available. Mottainai offers a quiet counterweight to this tendency, an invitation to notice, before something is lost, replaced, or allowed to pass unattended, that it may already carry more value than is currently being recognized. This is not a call to cling tightly to everything, to refuse ever to let go of objects, relationships, or periods of life that have genuinely run their course. Holding on too tightly is its own kind of imbalance, and it sits in some tension with the broader theme of impermanence, explored throughout this reflection. The point of Mottainai is not permanence for its own sake. It is attention, a willingness to actually see and appreciate what is present, for as long as it happens to be present, rather than looking past it, distracted toward whatever has not yet arrived. Perhaps at this hour, it is worth considering, without any particular urgency, what has quietly been present in a life for some time, without receiving much notice. A person seen regularly, but rarely truly looked at. An object used daily, but never really appreciated for what it represents. A stretch of ordinary time, still unfolding, that might later be looked back on with exactly the kind of tenderness that Mottainai tries gently to bring forward now, before that later moment of looking back arrives. The word Kaizen has, in recent decades, traveled a considerable distance from its origins. It is now widely associated with corporate management practices, manufacturing efficiency, and business consulting, particularly following its adoption within Japanese industry in the mid-20th century, where it came to describe a structured approach to continuous, incremental improvement in manufacturing processes. In this context, Kaizen refers to small, ongoing adjustments made consistently over time, rather than large, disruptive overhauls attempted all at once. This corporate meaning is genuine and historically accurate, but it is a fairly narrow and relatively recent application of a much older and simpler idea, kai, meaning change, and zen, meaning good, together suggesting something closer to change for the better, or gradual improvement, an idea with roots that reach further back into general Japanese thought about growth, learning, and self-cultivation, including certain threads of Buddhist and Confucian, influenced thinking about the gradual refinement of character and skill over the course of a lifetime. It is worth separating Kaizen from its more recent productivity-oriented associations for a moment, because the philosophical version of the idea, examined more slowly, contains a genuine and useful tension that the corporate version tends to flatten. The tension is this: how does a person hold together two things that can feel, at first glance, contradictory: an acceptance of oneself and one's life as they currently are, imperfect and incomplete, and a continued willingness to grow, adjust, and refine that life over time? Many approaches to self-improvement lean heavily on the second half of this tension while neglecting the first, treating the current self as fundamentally inadequate, a problem to be corrected, a rough draft awaiting the real, improved version that will supposedly arrive once enough effort has been applied. This can produce a particular kind of quiet, chronic dissatisfaction, and hence that the present self is never quite sufficient, always slightly behind some imagined, improved version that remains permanently just out of reach. Kaizen, in its more thoughtful and historically grounded sense, does not require this kind of self-rejection as fuel for growth. Gradual improvement does not necessarily depend on first believing that the current state of things is unacceptable. It can proceed from a rather different starting point, one closer to acceptance, an acknowledgement that the current state of things, imperfect as it is nonetheless where things genuinely stand right now, followed by a quiet willingness to make it slightly better. Not because the current state is intolerable, but simply because gradual refinement is, in itself, a natural and ongoing part of being alive. Consider the difference between two people learning a skill, a craft such as pottery, for example. The first approaches each attempt with a kind of harsh internal commentary, treating every imperfect bowl as evidence of continued failure, a reminder of how far they remain from some imagined standard of mastery. Each session becomes an exercise in self-criticism as much as an exercise in craft. The second approaches the same practice with a different internal posture, acknowledging that today's bowl is, in fact, slightly different from last month's bowl, perhaps somewhat more even, perhaps handled with somewhat greater confidence, without treating today's bowl as a failure simply because it remains imperfect. Both people may, over the course of years, arrive at similar levels of technical skill, but the process is likely to feel very different for each of them, and the second approach seems considerably more sustainable, less likely to be abandoned out of exhaustion or despair, precisely because it does not require ongoing self-punishment as its motivating force. This distinction matters beyond craft, extending into how a person might relate to their own character, habits, and choices over the course of a life. A person can recognize, honestly, that a particular habit is not serving them well, and can make gradual, gentle adjustments toward something different, without needing to first declare themselves fundamentally broken or inadequate as a person. The recognition of an area for growth does not require self-rejection as its precondition. It requires only honest attention and a willingness to make small, sustained adjustments over time, adjustments that, individually, might seem almost too small to matter, but that accumulate, across months and years, into meaningful change. There is a useful image here, drawn loosely from the broader philosophical tradition surrounding Kaizen, of a path rather than a destination. A destination implies a finish line, a point at which the process of growth concludes, and a final, completed version of the self is achieved. A path implies something continuous, without a fixed end point, walked not because arrival is the goal, but because walking itself, the ongoing process of small adjustments and gradual learning, is simply part of what it means to be a living, changing person. Under this image, being unfinished is not a temporary and regrettable state on the way to some eventual completion. It is, more accurately, the permanent condition of anyone still alive and still capable of change. Completion, in the sense of a final, static, fully finished self, is not actually available to a living person. It becomes available only in retrospect, described about someone whose life has already ended. This offers a way of holding both halves of the earlier tension together without contradiction. A life can be accepted as it currently is, imperfect, unfinished, carrying old mistakes and unresolved difficulties. And it can also continue to grow and change gradually, without the growth requiring a rejection of the present as its starting condition. A person can say, honestly, this is where I currently am, and this is not where I necessarily want to remain forever, without those two statements being in conflict with one another. The first statement is simply a description of the present. The second is simply an orientation toward gradual, ongoing change. Neither one cancels the other. There is also something worth noticing about the specific pace suggested by genuine Kaizen, as distinct from its more urgent, achievement-oriented corporate cousin. The original spirit of gradual improvement tends to favor small, sustainable adjustments over dramatic, effortful transformations, attempted all at once. A small adjustment, repeated consistently, tends to compound over time in ways that are easy to underestimate in the moment, and only become visible much later when a considerable distance has quietly accumulated between where a person started and where they now find themselves, without any single dramatic moment marking the change. Perhaps at this hour, there is no need to resolve anything about growth or change at all. It is enough, perhaps, to notice that whatever has not yet been figured out, whatever habit remains stubborn, whatever aspect of a life still feels unfinished, does not need to be resolved by morning or by next year, or ever completely, in order for the slow, quiet process of gradual refinement to continue exactly as it already has been, mostly unnoticed, in the background of an ordinary life. There is a long tradition within Japanese poetry, painting, and daily life of paying close attention to the changing seasons, not merely as a backdrop to human activity, but as something worth attending to in its own right, carrying its own emotional weight and its own particular beauty at each stage of the year. Classical Japanese poetry, particularly the short verse, forms such as haiku, traditionally required a seasonal reference, a word or image that placed the poem within a specific moment of the year's turning, whether the first cherry blossoms of early spring, the sound of cicadas in high summer, the sight of scattered red leaves in autumn, or the particular quality of snow settling quietly over a winter garden. This was not a minor decorative convention. It reflected a deeper assumption that time itself has texture, that a moment in spring is genuinely different in character from a moment in autumn. And that part of living attentively means noticing which particular moment one currently occupies. Matsuo Basho, one of the most celebrated poets working in this tradition, spent much of his later life traveling on foot through the Japanese countryside, recording his observations of nature and the passage of time in short, precise verses. His most famous journey, recorded in a travel diary, generally translated as Narrow Road to the Interior, or sometimes Narrow Road to the Deep North, was undertaken partly as a kind of pilgrimage to places associated with earlier poets, and partly as a deliberate encounter with impermanence itself, since Basho travelled during a period of his life when he was acutely aware of his own mortality, uncertain whether he would survive the journey at all. His poems from this period are spare and understated, often built around a single precise observation: a frog entering an old pond, the sound of cicadas seeming to seep into rock, without elaborate commentary or explanation attached. The observation is simply offered, and the reader is left to sit with it. This kind of close, unadorned attention to natural detail reflects something worth considering about how seasonal awareness functions more broadly. Modern life, for many people, has become somewhat detached from seasonal rhythm. Climate-controlled buildings maintain roughly the same temperature throughout the year. Food that was once available only during specific seasons can now be purchased at any time. Artificial light extends the day well past the hours that natural light would otherwise permit, blurring the distinction between the long days of summer and the short days of winter. Under these conditions, one day can begin to feel very much like the next, regardless of the actual season, and the specific character that a given time of year would once have carried can fade into a kind of generalized sameness. Seasonal awareness, of the kind cultivated within this poetic tradition, offers something of a corrective to that sameness. Spring carries a particular emotional quality, associated with beginnings, renewal, and a certain fragility, evident in the brief blooming of cherry blossoms discussed earlier. Summer carries a different quality, often associated with intensity, fullness, and a kind of active, outward energy. Autumn carries a quality of gradual withdrawal, of color intensifying just before it fades, connected closely to the sensitivity toward passing things explored earlier through Mono no Aware. Winter carries a quality of stillness, bareness, and a kind of quiet interior turning. The natural world drawn inward, conserving itself, waiting. None of these qualities are fixed or universal in any strict sense. They vary by region, by climate, by individual temperament and experience. But the underlying principle, that different periods of time carry genuinely different characters, and that part of attentive living involves noticing which character currently surrounds a person, offers a useful counterweight to the flattening effect of modern, climate-controlled, artificially lit daily life. A walk taken specifically to notice the particular quality of an autumn evening, the specific slant of low afternoon light, the specific smell of cooling air, restores something that a life lived entirely indoors, disconnected from these shifts, can quietly lose, without anyone quite noticing the loss. This seasonal awareness connects meaningfully to the human lifespan as well, an association that appears frequently throughout Japanese poetry and aesthetic thought. Spring is often associated in this tradition with youth, summer with the fullness of maturity, autumn with the gradual approach of age, its particular beauty inseparable from its proximity to ending, winter with old age, stillness, and the approach of death. This mapping should not be taken too literally or too rigidly, since a human life does not move through these stages in perfectly discrete divisions, and plenty of people experience what might be called autumn qualities, a certain gathering, reflective quality, well before old age, or winter qualities of stillness during periods of youth marked by illness or hardship. But the broader association is worth sitting with, because it offers a way of relating to the different stages of a human life that does not treat only one season, typically summer, the season of peak vigor and productivity, as inherently more valuable than the others. Under a narrower view, one that privileges youth and peak physical capacity above all else, aging can only be experienced as loss, a steady decline away from the one season that was supposedly worth having. The seasonal framework offers a different possibility. Autumn is not simply a diminished version of summer. It carries its own distinct beauty, arguably one of the most visually striking of the four seasons, precisely because of its particular relationship to ending. Winter is not simply an absence of the other three seasons. It has its own stillness, its own particular clarity, associated in various traditions with a kind of quiet interior depth unavailable during the busier seasons. There is something worth considering here about resisting the temptation to treat any single period of a life, whether a particular decade, a particular relationship, or a particular set of achievements, as the definitive high point against which everything before and after must be measured and inevitably found wanting. Each season of a life, examined honestly and without the distorting comparison to some imagined peak, may carry its own distinct character worth attending to on its own terms, rather than only in relation to whatever came before it. If it happens to be raining outside tonight, or if the air carries whatever particular quality belongs to this specific point in the year's turning, there may be something worth noticing in it, not because the observation needs to lead anywhere in particular, but simply because this specific night, at this specific point in the yearly cycle, will not occur again in quite this form. Long before Buddhism arrived in Japan from the Asian mainland, there existed, and continues to exist today, a set of practices and beliefs generally referred to as Shinto, a term that translates roughly as the way of the kami. It would be a mistake to describe Shinto simply as nature worship, a phrase that flattens something considerably more layered. Kami is a difficult word to translate precisely into English. It is sometimes rendered as gods or spirits, but neither of these captures the concept fully. Kami refers to a broad category of sacred presences, which can be associated with striking natural features: a particular mountain, a particular ancient tree, a waterfall, a large stone, but can equally be associated with ancestors, with certain human qualities or virtues, with specific shrines, or with particular aspects of experience that inspire a sense of awe, reverence, or heightened significance. What is worth drawing out from this tradition, without attempting to explain or summarize Shinto belief in its entirety, since it is a living religious tradition with considerable internal diversity across different shrines, regions, and historical periods, is a particular way of relating to the physical world that treats certain ordinary elements of the landscape as already inherently worthy of a kind of attention and respect that goes beyond their mere physical or practical usefulness. A large old tree standing beside a shrine is not simply timber that has not yet been cut down. It may be understood as a dwelling place for a kami, marked by a rope of woven straw, treated with a formality and care that a purely utilitarian view of trees would not extend to it. A particular rock formation, a particular bend in a river, a particular mountain visible from a village. These ordinary features of the landscape, present everywhere and easily overlooked, can be understood within this framework as already carrying a kind of significance that does not need to be added or constructed. It is treated as already there, waiting simply to be noticed and honored. This offers an interesting contrast with a more common modern assumption, the assumption that significance has to be built, earned, or constructed, that the ordinary world, left to itself, is simply neutral material, without inherent meaning, until human effort or achievement transforms some portion of it into something significant. Under that assumption, a mountain is just rock and elevation, until someone climbs it, sets a record, or builds something notable upon it. A tree is just biomass until it becomes lumber, or until it becomes the subject of a scientific study, or until some human use has been found for it. Significance, in this view, arrives from the outside, applied by human effort onto otherwise indifferent material. The Shinto sensibility toward kami suggests, instead, that significance may already be present in the ordinary world, prior to and independent of anything humans do with it or to it. The mountain does not need to be climbed in order to matter. The old tree does not need to be turned into anything useful in order to be worthy of respect. Their significance, within this way of seeing, does not depend on human use or human achievement at all. It is simply there, built into the fabric of the place itself, available to be noticed by anyone who happens to pause long enough to notice it. This has some quiet implications for how a person might relate to their own immediate surroundings, wherever they happen to live, regardless of whether those surroundings include anything as dramatic as a mountain or an ancient tree. Consider an ordinary street, walked along many times, so many times that it has become almost invisible, absorbed into the background of daily movement rather than actually seen. Consider a particular tree along that street, unremarkable, walked past hundreds of times without ever really being looked at. Consider the specific quality of light that falls across a particular room at a particular hour of the afternoon, present every single day, and yet almost never actually noticed, because nothing about it seems to demand attention. The Shinto sensibility toward sacred presence offers, without requiring any particular religious commitment, a way of returning attention to precisely these overlooked, ordinary features of a familiar environment. Not by declaring them officially significant through some external act, a record set, a monument built, a photograph taken and shared, but simply by pausing long enough to actually look at what has been present all along, unnoticed only because it was never extraordinary enough to interrupt the ordinary flow of attention moving elsewhere. There is a connection worth drawing here to the earlier discussion of Mottainai, the awareness of value already present that tends to go unnoticed and therefore wasted. A landscape treated as already sacred, already worthy of attention, is a landscape less likely to be treated carelessly, discarded, or paved over without consideration, precisely because its worth is not assumed to depend on some future use humans might find for it. It is assumed to already have worth, simply by virtue of being what it already is. This does not require adopting Shinto belief as a religious commitment in order to draw something useful from this way of seeing. It can function, for someone entirely outside that tradition, as a kind of quiet suggestion, an invitation to notice that the world immediately surrounding a person, however ordinary it might appear, however many times it has already been walked past without a second glance, might already contain more than has been noticed so far. Not because anything about it has changed, but because attention, when it finally turns toward something ordinary and actually looks, tends to discover that ordinary things were never quite as empty of significance as their familiarity had made them seem. Perhaps somewhere nearby, even at this late hour, there is something that has been present for a long time without ever really being seen. A tree outside a window, a particular worn step, a familiar patch of sky. It does not need to become extraordinary in order to deserve a moment of attention. It was, perhaps, worth noticing all along. There is a particular quality that belongs to something made slowly, by hand, over a long period of time, that is difficult to describe precisely, but is nonetheless usually recognizable when encountered. A ceramic bowl thrown on a wheel by someone who has practiced the same basic motion for 30 years carries something that a bowl produced identically, thousands of times, by a machine in a factory does not carry, even if the machine-made version is, by some objective measures, more symmetrical and more consistent. The difference is not simply a matter of appearance. It has something to do with the presence of time and attention embedded in the object, a kind of residue left behind by the particular person who made it, on the particular day they made it, using hands that had learned their skill slowly, through years of repetition, failure, and gradual refinement. Japanese craftsmanship traditions, spanning ceramics, woodworking, textiles, knife-making, calligraphy, and many other fields, have historically placed considerable emphasis on this quality of accumulated, embodied skill, developed through long apprenticeship and repeated practice, often over periods measured in decades rather than months or years. A traditional apprenticeship in a craft such as woodworking or sword-making might involve many years of preparatory work, sharpening tools, cleaning the workshop, observing the master craftsman at work before the apprentice is permitted to attempt the central techniques of the craft themselves. This slow pace can seem, from a modern efficiency-oriented perspective, almost absurdly patient, perhaps even wasteful of the apprentice's early years. But within the tradition itself, this slowness was not considered a flaw or a delay to be minimized. It was understood as necessary, a recognition that certain kinds of skill, particularly the kind that eventually allows the hands to work with the fluency described earlier as Mushin, cannot be rushed or shortened without the resulting skill remaining shallow, technically competent perhaps, but lacking the deeper integration that only long practice can produce. There is a distinction worth drawing here between speed and care, two qualities that are often, though not always, in some tension with one another. Modern production, across a great many fields, tends to prioritize speed, asking how quickly a given object or outcome can be produced, how efficiently resources can be converted into finished results. This is not inherently wrong, and plenty of genuinely valuable things have been produced quickly and efficiently. But craftsmanship traditions of the kind under discussion here suggest a different question, one that is asked less frequently in a culture oriented primarily around speed and efficiency. What happens when something is given more time than strictly necessary? What does additional, unhurried attention actually add to an object or to a piece of work beyond what could have been achieved more quickly? Consider a meal prepared quickly, with efficient, practiced movements, using good ingredients, and a meal prepared slowly by someone who has taken considerably more time than necessary, testing, adjusting, tasting repeatedly along the way, attending closely to small details that a faster process would have overlooked entirely. Both meals might use identical ingredients. Both might even taste quite similar to an unfamiliar palate. But there is often something perceptible in the difference, something that becomes apparent not necessarily in the taste of any single bite, but in the overall experience of the meal, a sense difficult to fully articulate, that more care went into this particular version, and that this care is, in some diffuse way, present in the eating of it, even for someone who cannot say exactly what accounts for the difference. This connects to a broader philosophical point about the relationship between process and product, a distinction that craftsmanship traditions have historically taken quite seriously. There is a tendency, understandable enough, to evaluate a piece of work almost entirely by its finished result, asking only whether the final object is good, useful, or attractive, while giving relatively little consideration to the process by which it was made. Craftsmanship traditions push back against this tendency, at least implicitly, by suggesting that the process itself carries value that is not fully reducible to or replaceable by the value of the finished object alone. The years spent by a craftsman refining a particular technique are not merely instrumental, valuable only insofar as they eventually produce good finished objects. The years of practice themselves, the slow accumulation of skill, the repeated engagement with the same basic materials and motions over an extended period of a person's working life carry their own significance, a significance that exists independently of, though it also contributes to, whatever objects eventually emerge from that practice. This has an implication worth sitting with for activities that fall well outside formal craftsmanship, extending into the more ordinary tasks that make up daily life. Cooking a meal, tending a small garden, repairing something that has broken, writing a letter by hand rather than typing it quickly. These ordinary activities can be approached either as tasks to be completed as efficiently as possible, obstacles standing between a person and whatever comes next, or as activities worth giving genuine attention to in their own right, regardless of how quickly or slowly they happen to be completed. The difference is not primarily about the outcome. A meal cooked quickly and a meal cooked slowly can both, in the end, be nourishing. The difference is about what the activity itself is permitted to be while it is happening, whether it is treated purely as a means toward some later end, or whether it is allowed, at least occasionally, to be something worth attending to for its own sake, in the time it actually occupies. There is a particular kind of satisfaction, familiar to many people, even outside any formal craft tradition, that comes from making something with one's own hands, however modest the result: a meal, a small repair, a piece of writing, a garden bed prepared and planted. This satisfaction does not seem to depend primarily on the objective quality of the finished result, since even a modest, imperfect result made carefully by one's own hands often produces a deeper satisfaction than a superior result produced quickly, or produced by someone else entirely. This suggests that some meaningful part of what craftsmanship traditions are pointing toward is not really about the object at all. It is about the quality of attention given during the making of it, an attention that becomes, in a sense, part of what the finished object actually contains, even if no observer looking at it later could say precisely how. Whatever hands have been busy with today, whether something demanding significant skill or something quite ordinary, there may be something worth considering in how that work was actually approached, not only whether it was finished, but whether, at any point during the making of it, there was room for the kind of unhurried attention that this old tradition of craftsmanship continues quietly to hold up as valuable in itself. By this point in the night, a number of ideas have been laid alongside one another, each drawn from a somewhat different corner of Japanese thought, aesthetics, religion, and daily life. Wabi-Sabi, finding value in imperfection and the marks left by time. Mono no ahwa-rai, finding a particular kind of beauty in things precisely because they are passing. Ikigai, locating meaning not in a single grand purpose, but in an accumulation of ordinary, often small sources of value. Ma, allowing empty space to remain empty, rather than treating it as something requiring correction. Yūgen, permitting some things to remain partly mysterious, rather than demanding full explanation. Mushin, a mind not rigidly gripped by its own thoughts and self-evaluations. Ichigo Ichie, a recognition that every meeting, however ordinary, occurs exactly once. Shikata ga, a way of setting down the exhausting internal argument with what has already happened, or what cannot be changed. Mottainai, noticing the value already present rather than looking past it toward what has not yet been acquired. Kaizen, a way of growing and refining a life without requiring self-rejection as the fuel for that growth. None of these ideas, examined individually, offers a complete philosophy of life on its own. But taken together, loosely and without forcing them into a single tidy system, they seem to circle around a related set of questions. Questions that were named near the beginning of tonight's reflection, and that are worth returning to now, with the benefit of everything considered since. Can a life be meaningful without becoming the life that was originally imagined for it? Most lives, examined honestly, diverge considerably from whatever plan or expectation shaped their early stages. Careers take unexpected turns, sometimes toward disappointment, sometimes toward possibilities that could not have been anticipated in advance. Relationships that once seemed permanent end, sometimes painfully, and relationships that were never planned or expected become some of the most significant connections a person will ever have. Ambitions once held tightly are set down, sometimes with real grief, sometimes with a quiet and almost unnoticed relief. The specific life a person is actually living at any given moment is very rarely identical to the specific life they once imagined they would be living by this point. There is a way of relating to this divergence that treats it primarily as failure, a persistent falling short of an original, better plan that circumstances, or perhaps one's own choices, prevented from being realized. Under this way of seeing, the actual life being lived is perpetually compared against an imagined alternative, and the comparison tends to leave the actual life looking somewhat diminished, since imagined alternatives, unconstrained by the actual difficulties and complications of real time, tend to look cleaner and more successful than anything that has actually had to survive contact with reality. Wabi-Sabi, considered carefully, suggests a different way of relating to this divergence. The actual, imperfect, unplanned life, marked by all the accidents, adjustments, and unexpected turns that any real life accumulates over time, is not a damaged version of some cleaner, more perfect life that should have happened instead. It is, in fact, the only life that has actually existed in time, the only one that has been genuinely lived rather than merely imagined. The imagined alternative, the version untouched by disappointment, delay, or unexpected turns, has never actually been lived by anyone, because no life, examined closely enough, manages to unfold without such complications. In this sense, every life that has actually been lived carries the particular marks of Wabi-Sabi, the marks of having existed inside real time rather than remaining a flawless, static idea. Mo no ahwa re adds something further to this. The specific relationships, opportunities, and periods of life that have already passed, including whatever version of a planned or hoped for life did not come to pass, are not simply absent as though they had never mattered. Their passing, and the quiet sorrow that can accompany it, can coexist with a genuine appreciation for what did occur, in exactly the way this particular unplanned life actually unfolded. The sadness of what did not happen and the appreciation for what did happen are not, as it turns out, mutually exclusive. They can be held together, the way awa re always seems to hold sweetness and sorrow together, refusing to separate them cleanly. Ikigai offers a further release from a related pressure, the pressure to locate one's entire sense of purpose in whatever specific ambition did or did not come to fruition. A life that did not achieve its original, singular aim can still be rich with reasons for living, reasons that may have very little to do with that original aim at all, reasons closer to relationships, small pleasures, ordinary routines, and unexpected sources of meaning that emerged only because the original plan gave way to something else. Shikata ga nae offers, perhaps, the most direct relief from the exhausting comparison between the actual life and the imagined one. At a certain point, the original plan, whatever it was, and whatever circumstances prevented it from unfolding as expected, cannot be helped. It has already happened, or already not happened, and no further argument with that fact will change it. What remains available is the life that is actually here, in its current, unplanned, imperfect form, still unfolding, still open to the small, gradual adjustments that Kaizen describes, still containing, quite possibly, more Mottainai, more already present and unnoticed value than has yet been fully recognized. None of this requires declaring that the original plan did not matter, or that its loss should not be grieved. It simply suggests that grief for an unrealized plan and appreciation for the life that actually exists are not opposites requiring a choice between them. Both can be true, held together the way many things explored tonight have turned out to be held together. Sorrow and beauty, absence and presence, imperfection and value, each pair less opposed than they initially appeared. A life does not need to be perfect in order to be worth living, or even quietly worth being glad for. It does not need to match the life once imagined for it. It only needs to be the life that is actually here, uneven, unfinished. And precisely because of all that, genuinely its own. There is a particular kind of suffering, familiar to almost everyone at some point, that arises not from any single event, but from a persistent wish that temporary things would become permanent. A wish that a particular period of happiness would simply continue indefinitely, without the changes that time inevitably brings. A wish that a person currently present in one's life would remain exactly as they currently are, never aging, never changing, never eventually gone. A wish that a particular feeling, a particular closeness, a particular sense of things being right could somehow be preserved exactly as it is, protected from the ordinary erosion that time applies to everything it touches. This wish is entirely understandable. It arises naturally from caring about things, since caring about something and wishing it would not end are closely related responses. But the wish itself, examined honestly, is asking for something that has never actually been available to anyone, at any point in history, regardless of wealth, power, or effort. Nothing that exists within time has ever remained permanently unchanged. Every relationship, every body, every home, every era, every version of the self has always been in motion, always becoming something slightly different from what it was a moment before, even when the change is too gradual to notice directly. Much of what has been explored tonight can be understood in one way or another as different responses to this single difficult fact that everything changes and that nothing can be held permanently fixed in its current, cherished form. Wabi-Sabi responds to this fact by finding beauty specifically in the marks that change leaves behind, rather than treating those marks as damage to be regretted. Mono no Ahuarai responds by allowing the awareness of ending to deepen appreciation rather than to poison it. Ichigo Ichie responds by treating each moment's uniqueness, its very unrepeatability, as a source of value rather than a source of loss. Shikata responds by setting down the exhausting argument against changes that cannot, in any case, be prevented. Kaizen responds by finding a way to keep growing without needing anything, including the self, to become permanently fixed in some final, completed form. Taken together, these ideas do not offer a way of preventing change, since no philosophy, however carefully constructed, actually has the power to stop time. What they offer, instead, is a different relationship with the fact of change itself, one that does not require constant resistance, constant grief, or constant anxious grasping at whatever currently seems good, in a doomed effort to prevent it from eventually becoming something else. Consider a relationship that has lasted many years. The relationship, examined honestly across its full span, has not remained the same relationship throughout. It has passed through many distinct phases, some easier, some more difficult, shaped by circumstances neither person could fully control, by the different people each person happened to be becoming across the years, by external pressures that arose and eventually passed. A demand that the relationship remain exactly as it was during its easiest, most cherished phase would be a demand for something that relationships, by their nature, cannot actually provide, since a relationship that never changed would not really be a relationship between two living, changing people at all. It would be something closer to a photograph, admired but no longer actually alive. There is a difference, worth sitting with, between loving something and demanding that it stay fixed. Love, in its fuller sense, seems able to accommodate change, to continue caring about a person, a place, or a version of life, even as all three continue shifting into forms that were not originally anticipated. The demand for permanence, by contrast, tends to place conditions on that care, offering full appreciation only for as long as the thing in question remains recognizable as its earlier, more familiar form, and withdrawing some portion of that appreciation once change has occurred. This is not to say that change should be welcomed indiscriminately, or that loss, when it comes, should not be genuinely grieved. Grief, examined honestly, is not really evidence of having done something wrong. It is closer to evidence of having cared about something real, something that mattered enough to be missed once it changed or ended. What the various ideas explored tonight seem to suggest, taken together, is not that grief should be avoided, but that grief and appreciation are not actually opposites, and that both can be present, sometimes simultaneously, in relation to the same passing thing. Perhaps one of the more difficult and more useful reframes available within this loose collection of Japanese aesthetic and philosophical traditions is the suggestion that impermanence is not a flaw in the design of existence, an unfortunate feature that a better arranged universe would have corrected. It may be closer to the actual condition that makes experience possible at all, in the particular, textured, vivid, felt way that it is possible. A flower that never wilted would not carry the same weight as an actual flower, blooming briefly before it falls. A conversation that could be had again and again, identically at any time, would not carry the same weight as a conversation that occurs, as Ichigo Ichie insists, exactly once. A life that never ended would not, perhaps, carry the same urgency, the same felt significance, as a life understood to be genuinely finite, genuinely limited, genuinely moving, moment by moment, toward its own eventual close. None of this needs to be fully accepted tonight, or ever, in some final, settled way. These are not conclusions to be adopted once, and then permanently held. They are more like a set of lenses, available to be picked up occasionally, looked through for a while, and set back down again, offering, whenever they are used, a slightly different way of seeing what is otherwise the same ordinary, changing, temporary life that everyone happens to be living. The night has moved further along now than it had when this reflection began. Perhaps the room has grown a little cooler. Perhaps the sounds from outside, whatever they were earlier, traffic somewhere in the distance, a door closing in another part of the house, have thinned out even further. The way sound tends to thin out as a night gets later. The world gradually emptying itself of noise until very little remains, but the low, steady hush that seems to belong to the deep hours of night specifically. A quiet that daytime never quite manages to produce. There is nothing that needs to be resolved before morning. Nothing explored tonight was offered as an instruction, and nothing needs to be acted upon, remembered in detail, or applied deliberately to anything in particular. If any of it has settled somewhere quietly, that is enough. If most of it has already begun to blur together into a general impression, rather than a set of distinct ideas, that is also enough, since impressions, absorbed slowly over the course of a long, unhurried reflection, often settle more deeply than anything held too tightly in conscious memory. Wabi-Sabi suggested that imperfection does not remove value from a thing. It may, in certain lights, be part of where the value actually resides. Mono no Ahwa Rai suggested that things passing away does not make them meaningless, and that the awareness of their passing can deepen the experience of them, rather than diminishing it. Ikigai suggested that meaning does not require a single grand purpose, that it can accumulate quietly, in small and ordinary forms, across the whole of an unremarkable life. Ma suggested that emptiness has its own presence, that a pause is not simply an absence waiting to be filled. Yūgen suggested that not everything needs to be fully understood in order to be genuinely valued, that some depth is best left partly in shadow. Mushin suggested that the mind does not need to remain rigidly attached to every thought that passes through it, that thoughts can be allowed to arise and pass, without each one demanding to be followed all the way through. Ichigo Ichie suggested that every meeting, however familiar or routine it might seem, happens exactly once and cannot be precisely repeated. Shikata ga nai suggested that some things simply cannot be changed, and that the exhausting internal argument against them can eventually be set down, without that setting down requiring approval of whatever cannot be helped. Mottainai suggested that value already present in a life is easy to overlook, and worth noticing before it is lost or discarded. Kaizen suggested that growth does not require rejecting the present self as inadequate, that a life can be accepted as it currently is, while still, quietly and gradually continuing to change. None of these ideas, on their own, solves anything in a final sense. None of them removes the genuine difficulty of being alive, the genuine losses that occur, the genuine uncertainty about what still lies ahead. What they offer instead, taken together and held loosely, is a slightly different angle from which to view a life that was, in any case, already going to include imperfection, impermanence, uncertainty, and ordinary days that do not announce themselves as significant while they are happening. Consider for a final moment the possibility that life does not need to be completely understood before it is allowed to be appreciated. There is a common assumption, rarely stated outright, but often quietly present, that understanding must come first, that a person needs to have things figured out, resolved, and settled before they are entitled to feel any real sense of peace about them. Under this assumption, peace is always deferred, waiting for some future clarity that, for most people, across most of a life, simply never fully arrives. The ideas explored tonight suggest a different order is possible. Appreciation does not have to wait for understanding. A life can be genuinely appreciated in its current, unfinished, partly mysterious form, without first requiring that every question about it be answered. An imperfect life can still be a good one. This does not mean every difficulty within it should be minimized or waved away. It means only that imperfection, examined honestly, has never actually disqualified a life from being worth living, since no life, examined closely enough, has ever managed to avoid it. An unfinished life can still contain real meaning, since meaning, as Ikigai suggested, does not depend on arrival at some final, completed state. It can be present all along the way, in ordinary moments that do not look, from the outside, like anything especially significant. A quiet evening like this one can matter, even though nothing dramatic occurred within it. An ordinary conversation can matter, even though it will likely not be specifically remembered years from now. A relationship that has changed shape over time, sometimes painfully, can still matter, its current form no less real or valuable than whatever earlier form it once had. A memory can matter even though it belongs entirely to the past, and cannot be recovered in its original form. Something can be temporary, brief, already fading, and still, while it lasts, be entirely worth having. Outside, whatever the hour actually is by now, the darkness will eventually give way to morning, the way it always does, without needing to be asked or persuaded. The seasons, wherever this particular night falls among them, will continue turning, spring into summer, summer into autumn, autumn into the stillness of winter, and then, eventually, back toward spring again. The years, whatever number has already accumulated, will continue passing at the same steady, unhurried pace they have always kept, regardless of how anyone feels about their passing. People will continue changing, including the people closest to this particular life, and including, eventually and inevitably, the person listening to these words right now. Places will change. The self, examined honestly across enough time, has never actually remained fixed for very long, and will not begin doing so now. None of this can be kept exactly as it currently is. And yet, for this particular moment, whatever else may be true, life is here. Not perfect, not permanent, not fully understood, and perhaps never destined to be fully understood, no matter how much longer it continues. Simply here, for now, in this quiet room, at this late hour, breathing, existing, unfinished, and, in its own imperfect and temporary way, whole enough as it already is. There is nothing further that needs to happen tonight.